So in this third video for week 4, we're going to talk about the common research methods that we talked about last week and how you choose those methods and what they would look like in an actual design study that a student in your position might be able to do. So if you'll remember, the research methods that we talked about last week were discourse analysis, interviews, case studies, surveys, and meta-analysis. Discourse analysis is where you collect little d discourse, and that is like written pieces or spoken language that you've got some kind of transcript of or something, and then you identify what you're looking for in it, and you start looking for patterns by marking those things you're looking for. Interviews, of course, we're all kind of familiar with that. You sit down with someone you expect to be knowledgeable about a subject, and you ask them about their experience with that subject and their opinions on it and so on. And then you can combine interviews in a way similar to discourse analysis where you're looking for patterns, which is really what research is about, is looking for patterns. And then there's case studies, which are sort of like more involved interviews where you kind of follow someone through a process. In medicine, case studies are used for you have a very interesting case of someone has a unusual response to a treatment, or someone has a specific combination of conditions that make them an interesting example for some reason, whether they're a common example or whether they're an exception. And then their situation would be described in the paper as a case study. We do similar things in rhetoric studies, and many other fields will do case studies where they follow a particular instance of something. There is, for instance, an important case study that I read in my field about a graduate student who felt pressure to drop out because her identity as a fan fiction writer was coming in conflict with her identity as an academic writer, and she valued that fan fiction writer identity more highly, and the conflict between the values and the communities was becoming too much. So that's a really interesting way to do a case study. And so the way that it actually practically comes out is you conduct interviews with the subject, you collect material from the subject, you observe the subject during the process, and then you make notes on that and you describe it as an example of what you're talking about. Surveys, most of us are familiar with surveys, often because we've taken many surveys and so on. They're a quick way to get information about a large population, but they have to be very carefully designed, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. Meta-analysis is not really discussed in our textbook, but I've found in my experience a lot of students really want to do it because maybe they don't feel like they have original research to contribute, or maybe because when they do their research for their secondary sources, they find out that a lot of things have already talked about what they wanted to talk about. And so they're like, well, can I just talk about these things that are talking about what I want to talk about? And that's where meta-analysis comes in, where you are looking at a large body of things, research that is talking about the same thing, and you're looking for the big picture of, okay, well, where do they agree and where do they disagree? So how do you choose between these research methods? The real key to it is, what kind of a question are you asking? So some questions require big picture methods like surveys and meta-analysis, or some kinds of discourse analysis. Some require very minute kinds of methods, such as the case study or the interviews, or another method that we haven't talked about, the ethnography, which is similar to a case study, but is more about a community than an individual situation. And some questions actually require a mixture. So another thing to think about when you're deciding on a research method is, what resources are available to you? So consider, how much time do you have to do it? In our case, not very much, just a few weeks. That's, in the scale of research, not very much time. What kind of resources do you have? Do you have a grant to do it? Is it going to cost money? For instance, I use a specialized software to help me with large data, with large discourse analysis type projects. That software is quite expensive, and so I have to take that into account when I'm planning my research. Am I going to be able to have access to specialized software? Um, in this case, for your project, I don't expect you to use any specialized software. You should be able to do this research with resources that are freely available to you, either because they're already free or because you are a student at this university and have access to research resources. Um, how are you motivating your participants? Like, are you going to give them some kind of compensation? Are you going to give them free food or something? But if you're going to motivate them with something extrinsically, you have to think carefully about your ethics, which is the next thing that you have to consider when doing your research method. So how are you taking into account possible ramifications for your subjects? Are you respecting their autonomy and uh, being beneficent? You know, are you using a method that is actually going to get you answers for the questions that you have? And are you giving credit where credit is due? Um, and are you being transparent as much as possible? There are certain research methods and certain questions that require some level of deception, which, for the purposes of this assignment, will not be necessary. I can't see any situation where you would have to deceive a participant. However, for some kinds of research, especially like psychological research, where the participants' knowledge of the project may actually affect how they behave or how they respond, that's a major ethical concern of how do you handle that deception, and that's actually something that you absolutely have to get approved by the IRB if you're doing. So there's a lot of ethical concerns with research. Another thing to consider as a practical concern is how are you going to get access to the phenomenon you're studying? And in many cases, that might mean human subjects. So how are you going to get this fieldwork done? How are you going to recruit your subjects? So if you do a survey, how are you going to inform people that the survey exists and motivate them to take the survey? And if you don't get the resources that you're expecting, so let's say you're like, I'm going to do a survey and I'm going to get 100 participants. What happens if only 30 of them answer? Are you still going to be able to do your research in some way? How are you going to be able to modify that midstream if things don't go the way you expect? Obviously, you can't anticipate everything, but you can build your study in such a way to allow for some of that flexibility. And you also have to consider how the people that you're studying or the phenomenon that you're studying will respond to being studied. So some people are not comfortable knowing that they're being studied, and you have to respect that. So you might think that you're just asking questions. What harm is there? And so you say, hey, can I get an interview? And they're like, I don't really want to talk about that. You have to respect that, and so you have to accept how that's going to modify your study. The other thing is, if you just like ask someone point blank, why did you do that? They may not give you an accurate answer. They may give you the first thing that pops into their head. They may give you a narrative that they think makes sense, but it may not be the whole picture or even the actual picture. So you have to very carefully account for how is a participant going to respond to me, how is the phenomenon going to respond to being studied, because by studying it, you do interact with it in some way. Even if you're just a passive observer, your presence can be an issue. So when you design your study, you want to think very carefully about how what you are doing as a researcher might affect the phenomenon under study, or how what you want to happen might affect how you read the results. So that's really important. And in a lot of the humanities, and especially more recently as we're understanding the researcher as not necessarily apart from the phenomena they're studying. Many people are participant observers, and that's a specific classification of role for the researcher, in which they're participating in the activity, but they're also the researcher about the activity. And in those cases, it's very important to clarify the participant's role. For instance, I'm in the process of proposing a study on National Novel Writing Month. Well, I participate in National Novel Writing Month and have for a long time. So I have to carefully account for how my role as a member of this community and even a leader in this community is going to affect how people respond to me when I start asking questions. So think very carefully about the practical concerns of your study when you're selecting your research method. I'm going to post some bonus videos that are case studies, if you will, of each of the research methods that we talked about in this video and last week, where it's a imaginary student project that is practical and within the scope of what you could do for this assignment.